Hello and welcome to our webinar entitled Strategies for Strengthening Technology Transfer, Knowledge Exchange with Equality, Diversity, Best Practices. We're joined with a global panel here. The panel will introduce themselves later. Hopefully during this session, what we will do is deconstruct, discuss and explain some of the key components for equality, diversity and inclusion and some of the terminology that's used. Each panelist will talk from a personal perspective, taking one perspective, and then what we'll do is we'll go through to address some of the questions that you may have so we can have an open discussion. I'd just like to flag that if you would like to use closed captions, there is a CC box at the bottom of the screen. You should click on that and you'll be able to have closed captions that you can use. When you do that, you will get a restricted view, so you'll have just the speaker showing. So don't worry if that happens. This session is recorded, so hopefully what you'll do is come back later and access some of the footage, but also the resources that will be attached to this webinar. Okay, we'll go into the session now.
Thank you, Angie. I'll go ahead and kick us off. My name is Dr. Megan Aanstoos. I use she, her pronouns, and I am with Kentucky Commercialization Ventures. And today I'm going to be talking to you in my role as KCV Licensing and New Ventures Manager, but also as the past chair of Autumn EDI Committee, and I go as a co-founder of Get It, which is Global EDI and Tech Transfer. Today is all about sharing personal stories. None of us are here to represent an entire group, a nation, or a population. Instead, we're here to tell you what our experiences have been and some of the recommendations that we have for you based on what we've seen or heard. So, Anwar, are you able to share the slides? Thank you very much. So today I'm going to talk to you about ableism. What is ableism? Next. Ableism is an attitude. It's a stereotype. It's a barrier. And oftentimes it's a misconception. This is when we look at somebody else and we say they're different from us. They're other. They're even less than. Ableism can be as a result of a visual disability. Someone who's in a wheelchair. It can be a result of a semi-visible disability, someone who has a hearing loss, like I do, for example. Or it can be completely invisible, someone with ADHD, or someone who's undergoing cancer treatment. When we talk about ableism, it is the idea that all of these people are less than someone who does not have that same concern. Next. Next slide. Specifically, ableism is a system that places a value on human bodies and minds based on some loosely agreed to social construct. Ableism has been going on for millennia, and these constructed ideas are deeply rooted within other components of racism, bias, sexism, colonialism, and capitalism. Systemic oppression leads to people in society determining who is valuable, who is worthy, who should be able to reproduce, who should be able to excel, and who needs to simply sit back, keep their mouth shut, and behave. For those who don't know me yet, let me tell you, and let others tell you, I'm not very good at sitting back, keeping my mouth shut, and behaving. And therefore, I've come to learn that in order to get ahead in life, you have to challenge this systemic belief. You have to be able to say, no, I don't agree that people who look like me, or people who don't look like me, but also are considered less than by society, should be less than. So what do? How do we combat ableism? One of the first things is to educate yourself. One of the second things is to have conversations. And the third thing is to realize this is an ongoing process. You're not going to be able to have all the answers right away because all of us are individuals. All of us react differently with specific needs for our situation. Let me give you an example from last night where I went to a presentation at my university's campus and there were no captions available. So I sat in the back of the room with the rest of my office. I had a choice. I could go sit up front, maybe not the first row, that was reserved for speakers, but maybe the second row I could sit up and I could try and hear a little bit of what was being said. Or I could sit with my colleagues and not feel as othered, not feel as isolated. Or I could make a complaint, and that's what I ultimately did. I went to the head of our HR department and I said, you are being ableist here because you did not provide an opportunity for me to engage with the system in a way that made it an equitable and less oppressive method. When we talk about this kind of thing, it's every day. Whether it be that the sidewalk has a curb that you can't go over in a wheelchair, whether it be that you have moved furniture around the office so often that someone who is blind or low vision continuously stumbles or runs into things, whether it be that you ask people to focus and sit down in a meeting for 7 or 8 hours when due to musculoskeletal difficulties or ADHD, you are forcing them into a system that was not built to accommodate. Next slide. Next slide. So you can do the best you can until you know better. But when you know better, do better. Break down those systemic barriers. Offer opportunity to people without having to be asked. Put captions. Make sure your doors can be opened by someone with a wheelchair. Make sure you offer flexibility in how people engage. And then ask people, what else can I do for you? What else can I do to break down the systemic barriers and let you feel like you belong in this world just as much as I do? Thank you very much. And we can move on to Intan.
Great. Thank you so much, Megan. So my name is Intan Hamdan-Livramento. I am an economist working at the World Intellectual Property Organization. Now, first of all, let me just thank the organizers for convening this very important session. And it's actually quite timely as well, maybe overdue, but it's a discussion that we're seeing taking place in many different forums. And I'm glad to be able to present here some of the work that we're doing at WIPO, but also to share with you my personal experience in working at the intersection of gender and innovation. So let me just give you a quick backstory. The organization I work for, the World Intellectual Property Organization, we deal a lot about innovation. And so I spent most of my time thinking about innovation, how to encourage it, and how to actually facilitate innovation, and to identify barriers to innovation. And the thing that we realize as we're talking about innovation is in many cases, people think about innovation as being gender neutral. And that's not necessarily the case. Next slide, please. So in 2013, WIPO hired its first gender specialist. And the role of the gender specialist, and I have to mention her name here because she did a great work in starting us off, is Kaori Saito. And the role of the gender specialist was twofold. The first was internally, which is to raise the issue of gender within the organization to make people realize, to make our colleagues understand that there is a gender lens and gender perspective to innovation. And then the second role was also to raise awareness externally. And when we say externally, it's with regards to member states and innovators globally. And in this case, let me just share with you two things that I thought really worked at WIPO. The first one, our gender specialist, Kaori Saito, she decided to have gender focal points in different departments. And the role of the gender focal point was to actually help the manager to actually think about gender issues. Now, as an economist, I mean, back then, I was the only female economist in the whole division. And this is unfortunately a common thing in economics, in the field of economics. And two things raised in my mind. On one hand, I was thinking, oh, this is a great time for us to talk about gender, right? Because gender is a huge issue that hasn't been talked about as much as it should be. But the second thing I was thinking of was, hold on, I'm the only woman in this division. Am I going to be the one who has to advocate for people to talk about gender? Luckily, the way things turned out was that we thought about it, and I suggested to our chief economist at that time is, why don't we have a rotation where the gender focal points can rotate? It's not just one person, up to one person to advocate for gender issues. And great enough, my colleague Julio Raffo stepped up. He said, let me be the first gender focal point for our division. And this is an important thing. And the reason is because by my colleague Julio going through the whole training system, understanding gender, understanding the complexities, understanding everything that was underlying gender issues, he was able to advocate for us. And he was able to also, quote unquote, speak the language that people were listening. And this helped. So he was the first one. Then 2 years later, we rotated to another colleague of mine, Bruno Lefebvre, who also did a great job. Another, key ally for us. And finally, it came to me. So now it's rotation again. So I've passed it on to another colleague. So internally, this was a nice way, I think, that we dealt with the issue within the division. It's the sense of getting more people on board to understand the issues and to actually advocate. Now, the second part that I'd like to talk about is the fact of externally. So this is the other thing that we had to do, which is inform, or rather shed light on the issue of gender and innovation. And when we first started this, we started out with a seminar looking at, is there an issue of gender in innovation? The researcher that we brought in basically said, yes, there is an issue. But what was interesting was at that time, a few of the senior colleagues actually said, no, there is no issue. Technology is gender neutral. When we look at technology, there should not be any gender issue behind there. But the way we convinced them was to say, well, you know what? Is it? First, the question, is it? To ask to actually question the assumption that there is no issue of gender in technology. And secondly, to say, why don't we just take a look? Let's look at what the numbers tell us. Next slide, please. And this is what we realized. Okay, just to measure gender in innovation was not an easy endeavor. Luckily, there are a lot of people out there doing great research work on this. And so we were able to stand on their shoulders. And one of the things that we actually put together is that we developed WIPO's World Gender Name Dictionary to actually disambiguate patent inventor's name to identify if they are either male or female. Now, it is very binary, but so far this is how we've started. And when we published the first working paper that was related to this gender name dictionary, which was in 2016, we got a lot of discussion. It started a big discussion within IP offices of saying, hey, why are we not looking at this? Why are we not looking at the national level, what share of our inventors are female or what share are male? Just to see, right? Just to get a sense of where we stand and what we can do better. So we came up with this gender name dictionary, which got its second version. And the second version is useful in the sense of we actually incorporated more what we call more Asian names, specifically in the specific characters of that name, which also allows us to better identify females versus males within the language itself. The other thing that we also realized was that different regions and different cultures have different ways of approaching the role of the topic of gender. And because of this, we decided, let's take a look at it according to the different regions. And we tried to do this by organizing seminar series on innovation gender gap. The first one was in late October of last year. A follow-up will come up end of May. And basically what we try to do, we get together policymakers and we ask them, what are you doing in your country to look at this issue? And not only at the high policy level do we talk about it, we also try to get engaged with the chief economists or researchers within those regions to actually share with us what they found out about innovation gender gap within that region. We're also talking to different companies to also realize, companies and universities to also see what are they doing, because at the end of the day, what we want is to actually have policymakers having some sort of data, both from the general macro evidence, but also from the micro level, which is the firms and universities. And at the end of the day, what we'd like is actually to have some sort of a toolkit or methodology that different regions and different countries can use in order to actually look at the issue. Because at the end of the day, we cannot talk about the issue of gender without actually understanding where are we and what do we need to improve. And then the third thing that we're also doing is that we're starting to collaborate. Oh, we have started Informed, but it's gaining momentum now. We are collaborating across different sectors. And I call them silos because sometimes, when you are in different divisions or departments, you're only focused on that area. But the issue of gender, like a lot of the other issues here, is something that's across all sectors, across all departments. And it's important that we talk to each other in order to address the issue better, because there are some things that I know my colleagues who are dealing with patent law, who they have access to, or my colleagues who are dealing with member states in different regions like Africa, Asia, who are they talking to? Because at the end of the day, it's important for us to get all that data and all those case studies to actually understand what's happening, and then perhaps then make a good case of what can we do better and what are the challenges and how can we overcome those challenges. With this, I think I will pause here because I think we will pick up more later on. So thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you, Intan. And kia ora everyone, my name is May. Kia ora tātou, ko Tarusa te Monga, ko South Pacific Ocean te Moana, no Kirikiriwa aho, ko Lo toko whanau, ko May toko ingoa, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa. Greetings to you all, whatever time zone you're in. The mountain that I belong to is called Talisia in Lautoka, Fiji. My great-grandparents are buried on this mountain, and my mother was born in the shadow of it. The body of water I belong to is the South Pacific Ocean. It is the first body of water I swam in as a child, and when I depart this earth, that's where I want my ashes to be scattered. I live in Kirikiriroa, Hamilton, Aotearoa, New Zealand, where I've called home for the last 30 years. My family name is Lo, and my name is May. This pepeha is the Maori custom of introducing oneself by stating where you belong, where you come from, and who you are. And today, I want to focus my session on how Indigenous culture has been woven through the fabric of who we are as New Zealanders and what we do, and then how I see this, how it relates to then the knowledge transfer and tech transfer of what we do as a job. Now, New Zealand's history is really unique, and I encourage you all to dig into it after this if you're interested to find out more. But I won't go into that history today, as I can't do it justice in such a short space of time. Next slide, please. Though what I do want to touch on is that the recognition of Maori rights have been legislated through the government and adopted through our ministries for many years. Here in New Zealand, we actually recognise Mount Taranaki and the Whanganui River as legal entities in their own right, granting them legal protection over these sacred landmarks. And you're probably asking, what does this mean for the likes of knowledge exchange? Well, it means every government and every grant application that the government has there's a question on what does that research do to unlock the potential of Maori knowledge, resources and people. What is known here in New Zealand as the Vision Mātauranga policy. And the goal is to unite Mātauranga Maori and new discoveries to build a better, prosperous economy. So the legislation has come from the top down. Yes, the mandates have come from the top down, but in practice, how does that actually apply from those at the grassroots coming up? Well, those applying for those research grants, and I'm going to say first off that there's a lot of work that still needs to be done, but the seeds are starting to sprout. Next slide, please. The first is that meaningful, next slide, please. Thank you. And the first is that meaningful engagement with tangata whenua, or the tribes or iwi of a specific region. And collectively, these tribes of New Zealand make up a substantial portion of New Zealand's economy, with much potential to grow more. The government has mandated engagement, but here at your tech transfer office or your knowledge exchange commercialization professional, it's the people who really have to make that engagement meaningful, to find alignment of core principles and to work together to build something and to get it out into market. Secondly, what I see is that resourcing of in-house expertise has really facilitated the spread of knowledge and capability that feeds into deeper engagement with Maori. It's really common here in New Zealand to have an Office of Maori Development at the universities or Maori engagement specialists within your tech transfer offices. And having this knowledge embedded within your organisation means that the practice and incorporation of Maori tikanga or customs isn't a dark art. It's not feared, but it's really respected and commonplace. And actually, it's okay to give it a go, to make mistakes, and to cry again. Next slide, please. And lastly, in my opinion, and the most fundamental thing in this whole how incorporation of culture works, is that it's a shift in mindset and the purpose behind why we are here to commercialize and to get knowledge out into the market. And when we look at a piece of IP traditionally, what information do we need to look at to decide whether or not we progress that down this commercialization pathway? Well, of course, you look at things like who owns the IP, how much return does that university get, which industry partner would benefit from it. Well, if we take the Indigenous Maori view, it really focuses on guardianship rather than ownership. And the statement is really powerful. So I'll say it again. The focus changes to one of guardianship rather than ownership. And then if you think about it that way, the questions then pivot to who owns this and what are the returns, to how do we protect the sky, the sea, the land for our children, our grandchildren, our great-grandchildren. How does the commercialization of X benefit or harm our future generations? And this intergenerational approach really enables us as tech transfer professionals to look at that big long-term strategy of what we are doing here, which is really to build a better world for everyone where we all feel belonged. And that's really extremely powerful. So the concept of guardianship is so central to Maori culture, and is why in our introductions, the pepeha, it starts with what mountain do you belong to? What body of water do you belong to? Because fundamentally as humans, we want to protect things that we belong into. And if we know where each other belong, then we can connect with empathy and understanding. So I have a few suggestions of ways you can incorporate Indigenous culture into your tech transfer practices, but we'll move on to that as we go through the session. And I'd like to pass on the talking stick to Anji.
Thanks, May. My topic is race and representation. As a British Black scientist, technology transfer professional, this resonates greatly with me. My journey has been long. My career journey has been long and lonely from a race perspective. Next slide, please. As I progressed through university, not only was I the only Black person, but the only Black female. And as those who are attending this will know, technology transfer, knowledge exchange is not a profession that you go directly in from your A-levels. You have to go through the educational system. There's usually a technical background that you have before you enter the profession. One of the things that I found was that although I was the only person, the system the community, the environment did not adjust or shift in any way to make room for me because of my race or my ethnic background, my socioeconomic background, in any way. It was really where I had to accommodate to fit in. And this is usually what lends itself a lot of the time to, imposter syndrome, where you cannot be your authentic self. For me, as an example, over the last 2 decades, I could easily go to a conference, and this still happens, go to a conference where in the UK, where I was educated, 3.5% of the population is Black. In London, it rises to about 40%. But the thing is, I could go to a conference or a meeting, even tomorrow, and still be the only Black face there. This is how the sector does not reflect the community that we're in. Race is something that, in general, is still taboo in certain circles, and then others will say that it's not an issue. For example, if you have a look at somewhere like Spain or Italy, where the percentage of Black individuals dropped below 1, and then Scotland, again, it's below 1 as well. But then in the US, it's 12.5%, but it really is an issue. So it's something that is uncomfortable, because half of the time with race, it's really where to really measure and have a look at the impact of any positive action, you have to retrospectively account for where you are, the actions that have taken place. And these usually give astonishing statistics and practices. And it's uncomfortable for everyone, because the thing is, it does link a lot of the time to slavery. And, the view that there is a difference based on race, when we know from the cloning of the human genome that there's no biological basis for race. It really does question it. It really is a social construct. So for me, it's really where over the time, I think it shaped my view. I use my platform as a technology transfer professional to question a lot of the situations, a lot of the positions. It's really where I will have the conversation when it's uncomfortable. I know that's not everyone's view, and it's not everyone's personality that they will do that. Because the thing is, I will question why things are the way they are, and I will try and find a solution. I will be my authentic self. I'm unapologetically Black. But the thing is, I am British at the same time. As a professional in the technology transfer sector, not only will I ensure that equality, diversity feeds into everything I do, and I will encourage others to do that, but also the innovation that I'm helping to translate, I will try and ensure that it's accessible to others as well. We hear about clinical trials, that technologies that really can impact particular groups, it's not efficient on certain color, like skin colors, Black skin. Diagnostics that have never been tested on anyone with any diverse ethnic background. Drugs that really do not include like any underrepresented group. That should not be happening. Or technologies that are not accessible to everyone. So what can we do to actually change the way things are? Next slide, please. There are many things we can do. It's not going to be one fix, one tick box. It's continuous. And although each panelist is coming from a different perspective, they don't all sit. Each perspective doesn't sit by itself. There is overlapping. There is intersectionality. For race, representation really does matter. When I go anywhere within the community, I see many individuals, and I enjoy that. But the thing is, when I'm in my professional circle, I'd like to also see a reflection of true society. So institutions, technology transfer offices, establishments, what they can do is ensure that these individuals are at the table and participating. They're seen. Simple things like ensuring these individuals get out to conferences. We need to have a continuous flow of professionals entering the technology transfer and knowledge exchange sector. And that won't happen if someone has a look and feels that they won't belong, or they'll stand out, or it's going to be a battle because it's too much for one person to do. Those in the sector, like myself, really can introduce diverse perspectives and use their voice. Talk about lived experiences, highlight the other perspective, what it's like for someone. Also, like, talk about, how things have changed and the direction things are going in. Megan mentioned the pronouns before. She introduced herself using her pronouns. If you wish to use that, definitely do it. And don't feel that you stand out because you're the only person doing it in the room. There's no excuse for someone mispronouncing or changing your name because they feel that it's not something that they can cope with. Use phonetics. Tell that person outright. There's no excuse for that sort of behavior. When we're recruiting individuals into the sector, which is a challenge anyway, because the technology transfer and knowledge exchange profession, although it's existed for decades, is still sort of the secret profession that not many know about. Although COVID and the transition of technology to the patient in expedited time really did highlight the fact that there are many individuals helping to get innovation to the patient. We still need to ensure that we're not discriminating and our processes are not biasing individuals entering the profession. So one of the ways that we could do this is ensuring that when we recruit, the language that we use, the information provided is really inclusive and welcoming for everyone. One of the things we could do is de-identify CVs. Many individuals have names that definitely this is not going to be a Caucasian person. That should not be the grounds for discriminating against someone. And if we can take away some of these tools that support this behavior that it's in all of us to some extent, it means that we'll ensure that we're recruiting someone based on merit rather than whether that we think they will fit. A lot of individuals say, a lot of the time, it's really where we're not recruiting people of race, underrepresented race to the sector because, they don't have the qualifications. That's no excuse. Underrepresentation does not mean underqualified, in no means. One thing we can do within our offices, our establishments, is ensuring that there is an inclusive culture. Those who are within there, everyone contributes and everyone is of value. There are so many studies out now actually highlighting the value of a diverse workforce. This should be reflected in our practices and also how we go about within our offices, conducting our work. The last thing I think, which is quite important, because the thing is, although equality, diversity, and inclusion are talked about a lot, and they are hot topics and buzzwords at the moment, there is a race for everyone to try and have some policies and statements. But that means nothing if they're not put into practice and they do not work within the sector. If they don't work within the structure, the function, the technical area, it means nothing. These are just statements, badges. What we can do is ensure that if they do not fit, that we highlight and shape them so everything is EDI compliant. Technology transfer, knowledge exchange is a broad area. These are umbrella terms for many activities in really translating something from the bench to the bedside. Many individuals, a lot of, collaborations, change in sector, because the thing is, it's not usually the academic sector that will take any innovation to the market. What we can do is ensure that every step of the way, equality, diversity, and inclusion play a key role and is one of the key metrics with everything else that is considered. As I mentioned, representation matters. Thankfully, social media, television, we see individuals that really do reflect some of the individuals you know, that we can resonate with. But what we want to is have that within our immediate community, not just where we have to go to TV, you know, the cream of the cream. We have to make sure that those around us, everything that we do really is welcoming, and we can have the diversity that's required, that we really do get the best out of this sector. Next slide, please. The last thing I wanted to touch on, because the thing is, obviously with limited time, and race is a big area that I could talk about for days. I wanted to just bring this image up because it does mean a lot. We use the term equality, equity, inclusion, and belonging a lot. But what does it really mean in the real context? And this image, when you have a look, I think it explains it very clearly. And hopefully, you know, those who are here attending this session will come back, listen to what we've said, but also think about some of the things that we've actually put on the slides. This is one of the images that I'd like you all to have a look at and consider within your context, what does it really mean? When you say equality, does everyone have access? I know within my career, there are things that I never, you know, I was considered not suitable for based on race. But the hardest thing are the opportunities that I didn't know about until later. And I think it's really where those decisions behind closed doors that happened, or the upskill, the mentoring, the coaching, the training that could have helped me and was offered to others. And that's the equity piece. There's one thing being invited to the table, but the thing is, if no one is listening to you and you're never asked a question or you can't contribute, it's really, really difficult just sitting there silently. And then when you do voice anything, then there could be the stereotype. For me, if I voice up a lot of the time, it could be that someone will say like, oh, the aggressive Black woman. These are things that we need to consider within our behaviors, within the culture that we have. So I'm hoping this slide will get everyone thinking and questioning. And race, the discussion of race won't be the elephant in the room, the difficult, protected characteristic that no one really wants to encounter. It's uncomfortable looking where we're coming from and where we are. But the thing is, if we're moving in the right direction and we're looking for solutions and trying to address the issues, then it's a good thing. It's uncomfortable, but the thing is, this is where we grow. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Anji. Hi, everyone. I'm Maxine Ficarra. I'm CEO at ParxisAuril, and I joined Praxis in 2003, almost 20 years ago, as we first set up our national training programme for tech transfer practitioners. And I've been very privileged to lead the development of that organisation over all this time, and working through hundreds of expert volunteers, without whom nothing that we've achieved as an organisation would have been possible. So it's been an eventful couple of decades, not just in terms of the way that our knowledge exchange, knowledge transfer, tech transfer sector has evolved, and the amazing achievements and impact the results of our sector's efforts have had on the world at large, but in the way that society has transformed during that time, and particularly in our expectations of people and their attitudes and behaviours. And that's where I would like to focus today. Next slide, please, Anwar. I'm slightly poking fun by using this image and calling it the 1990s. I recognise that image, dates back much further than that, but I still felt that it represented something I wanted to talk about. So, yeah, I'm old enough to have seen a lot of change in the workplace, in particular during the last couple of decades. But for today, as this 53-year-old white woman with a nice job, wonderful family and a comfortable lifestyle, I ask myself, well, what on earth do I have to say that will be of use to anyone else? But I do, remember in my mid-20s feeling uncomfortable in male-dominated sales meetings where ego and bravado and poking fun at young women was the norm, when inappropriate comments about appearance and how people were dressed were commonplace in this small high-tech electronics company of the late 80s where I was at that time. And when even by the late 1990s, the only senior management ally that I had was a female marketing director who was often not taken seriously, just purely on the basis of her gender. And so for many years, I just accepted this sort of culture as the norm, certainly well into my 30s when I returned to work from maternity leave. And I had been very fortunate to be able to focus on being a stay-at-home mum for 3 years to 2 wonderful daughters. But then when I came back, I did effectively a full-time job in part-time hours. I juggled work and children and a very traditional home life where I was still largely responsible for running the household as well as being out at work. The next slide, please, Anwar. So as I joined Praxis 3 years later, I became a single working mum, and contrary to the way that single mums were regularly characterised in the press, often emboldened by government rhetoric at the time, I wanted to be a good role model for my girls who were still only at primary school. So what did I do? Well, I just worked harder, be proactive, focus on solutions, and really, my early role at Praxis was all about, understanding other people's drivers and instilling this culture of customer service, something that I was absolutely passionate about. And at that time, I didn't really think about the limitations of my gender in a broad sense at all, nor about the responsibility I had to influence beyond my own personal circumstances. And things were beginning to change in society at large in relation to equality at work, but I have to say that it was already eye-opening joining an organisation in the early 2000s, which was far more inclusive than anything I had ever experienced previously. Senior managers job sharing, unheard of in any previous organisation I'd been with. Men taking paternity leave and sharing the childcare responsibilities, wonderful progress. Of course, that's not to say there isn't a long way still to go, and working practices, still way behind the curve and under scrutiny across a number of organisations in the UK today. And of course, that's nowhere near consistent across the world. I've always prioritised people, understanding what they need and want, and having experienced almost 15 years of single working mum guilt, I truly believe in compassionate leadership, which I hope my team will agree, means that I want them to not only feel fulfilled and challenged by useful and impactful working lives, but equally to seek to achieve balance with their world outside of work, whether or not they have a family or other caring responsibilities. Next slide, please, Anwar. So I really feel the responsibility of the position that I now hold to do more to support all aspects of equity, diversity and inclusion activity. And at Praxis, we've started by doing what we can to raise awareness and spotlight this area with high-profile sessions at conferences, enabling group discussions, and just trying to work with other like-minded organisations to share ideas and amplify the messaging. And we do have a genuine new focus on inclusive recruitment practices for exec and volunteer experts who, of course, have this brilliant opportunity to be fantastic role models and platforms, across Praxis to represent the underrepresented. But I think where we're still struggling, actually, is that we've got quite a bit of catching up to do to document and make this work more visible. And in typical me fashion, I worry that I'm the roadblock, and I need to take my own advice and prioritise what's really important, and which is including asking for help. If I can give a couple of bits of practical advice to anyone of any gender out there still struggling with a lack of confidence or just navigating very old-fashioned working cultures, firstly, it's read. And a couple of books that really resonated for me personally, although I read them a while ago. And there's a quote from one of them here. Lean In by Cheryl Sandberg, who's the former CEO of Facebook. And then another book called How to Own the Room by Viv Groskop. And I can make those links available after the event. But, both really excellent and readable, practical texts with lots of helpful tips. And I'm sure that, there will be many other recommendations that people can share within this group and after this event. I think a book or some reading, recommended reading for helping the privilege, to better understand their privilege, is something that I think would also be helpful. Next slide, please, Anwar. And of course, this slide is not technically correct. Ally is a noun as well as a verb, but I just liked the way that it kind of presented itself. Yeah, allies, you know, be that ally. Identify the individuals you can work with to take action to help yourself or others, but just recognise that you too can be the ally. You don't need to be a woman to support gender equality, just as the colour of your skin does not stop you from challenging racial inequality. You don't need to be underrepresented to represent. Thankfully, I do think that the next generation are already way ahead of many of us. And my own daughters have completely different expectations of equality at work and at home. So perhaps us oldies did teach them something useful after all. Thank you.
Thank you, Maxine. What I'm going to do before we actually go into addressing any questions that you have, please put them in the chat. But also what I'd like to do is just go around. I know some of the panelists mentioned some action tips for the attendees to take. I'd just like to go around anything that hasn't been covered that you wish to mention, that you deliver them before we go into the discussions, and then we'll take any questions that you may have. And I'll start with you, Megan.
Thanks, Angie. So, as you all may be aware, I tend to give advice freely, and that's because I'm comfortable talking about my hearing loss, and I'm comfortable sharing my story. And so, not everyone is, but I encourage you, as tip number one, is to seek out people like me who are comfortable and ask the questions. Also, we have a fantastic invention in the internet where you can go online and you can look up all kinds of things yourself. So before you say, well, I don't know how to help, I don't know what to do, have you tried looking? That's certainly a step one. Another point of advice is to create those opportunities to be more inclusive. As an example, there's a recent job posting in a tech transfer office in the United States. And part of the minimum qualifications, amongst the number of years in leadership, the degree, experience with team building, is also a demonstrated commitment to diversity, equity, and inclusion. So building that into your job requirement, building that into your policies. How many of you have a diversity and inclusion statement that goes alongside your vision and mission statement? Making those kind of opportunities is a key beginning. But oftentimes the other thing that we hear is there's a great burst of excitement at the beginning and then it trails off. So check in with your colleagues. What are they not getting that they still need? As an example, for me, I use an iPad that has caption calling available. And this is a free service offered by the US government, the FCC, which allows me to be able to better engage with my counterparts around the world. That's a service that is an ADA accessible opportunity. But how many of you are offering that or letting people know that that's available? And for me personally, I feel much more welcomed when I don't have to ask, when I have an ally in the room who speaks up for me. Because as Maxine mentioned, allyship is more than just a word. It's how you present. So if I go to a conference and there's no captions and it's virtual and it's on Zoom and you absolutely can add captions to that, and someone else speaks up for me and someone else says, hey, you don't have the words turned on. Or, hey, you know what, our team is leaving because you haven't made this accessible in a day and age where it is possible to do so. That speaks volumes to me. I would also finally say, find and seek opportunities to increase your reach. So whether that be that you post a job and you pay that extra amount to ensure that you're reaching the diverse candidates you want to reach, or whether that means that when you say, I don't have a lot of resources, that means you still go out to the social work college, or to art or architecture, to psychology, and you speak to inventors who are outside of your normal scope. You go to the faculty senate meetings, but you also go to the Black Faculty and Student Association. You go to groups that aren't always engaged because they don't even know that they're welcomed. So when it comes to tech transfer, we have a lot of opportunities to make change. As another example, when we are looking at software programs that come in, ask your inventor, how did you train your data? Did you ensure that your data was unbiased? Or did you simply select all of your peers who look exactly like you to do your data training? When it comes to a technology and it's a drug, a pharmaceutical, how did you assess that this will be equally valuable for someone who looks different? Did you ensure that the side effects aren't going to cause someone to have complications down the line? We as tech transfer officers have responsibility and we have opportunity to create more equitable worlds.
Thanks, Megan. Intan, do you have any action points that you'd like to mention? I know you mentioned some during your talk, but the thing is, if there's anything additional that you'd like to mention.
Well, first of all, I really love what everybody else has mentioned, including Megan. I would love to include that. And it's great to know that even at the technology transfer level that you are asking those questions, because those are important questions. And those are questions that can inform later on what happens to the invention, how useful it is, and commercialization, and so on and so forth. So just to reiterate, I think what's really, really important is having key allies on your side, and in that sense, it has been a huge shift within the organization from when we first had the discussion in 2013 when we had the gender specialists come in to where we are now. So now we have, our senior management are saying, oh, look at the panel. Is it an all-male panel? This is an issue. So it was a change not only within, but also outside. And this is where the new generation comes in the sense of pointing out, hey, this is a manel. This is an issue, right? And then slowly, once we also deal with the gender, we're also dealing with issues of representation, diversity. Are we having diverse voices? Because it's not just gender, it's also background. It's also unique experiences that should be reflected. So key allies is very important, and part of convincing key allies is also to look at the data, because that's the other thing that perhaps maybe it's because of my training, that data is quite convincing. So even if you do not have the means of doing, industry-wide surveys, you can actually take a look. You sit in a room and you say, how many are women? How many are from different backgrounds? And you just make a mental note of this. Or, there was a suggestion within the gender focal points where someone said, hey, why don't we just take a look and use this timer of seeing how long did a male colleague speak versus a female colleague, right? But it's just data points, but there's so much that can be revealed about data. Like if you have 50-50 female and male, but then the male dominate a lot of the conversation, then you bring it up to the managers or whoever is coordinating the meeting and say, do you realize this? And perhaps that might change the conversation, saying, oh, for example, May, would you like to say something on this? Just to perhaps give the opportunity to someone else to give a voice. So these are the things that we realize what realizing, and we're, like you said in the beginning, Anji, this is a work in progress. So the more we do it, the more we learn from one another. These are the things that we can take from one another and use to highlight the issues that we're dealing with.
Thanks, Intan. May, are there any points that you would like to
Yes,
mention?
definitely. So I've got three actually and this is going to focus back onto how do we incorporate Indigenous culture into tech transfer office practices and systems. So my first one is to really take that time to understand the fundamental principles of what your country's Indigenous people really find important. What drives them? What makes them like value their systems and beliefs, because I bet you 99% of the times it isn't about financial returns. So what does that look like? And then how does that alignment work with what you as your office, your organization are thinking? And is there room to give and take? Because we'll need to do that. Secondly, is something that has happened here in New Zealand is that it's really the spread of knowledge of Indigenous knowledge and capability. And it's something that, how do we build in incentivizations into your team to help build that knowledge, go out, help learn the language, the customs, and make it ordinary. And that sounds terrible, but make it to a point where you can use it into the day-to-day, build it into your custom, like the meeting openings, the meeting closings, and let people understand that it's okay to give it a try, that it's fine if you're not going to get it right the first time with pronunciations or whatever that is, because that's the very meaning of just giving it a go. The participation piece is the first step in overcoming that barrier. And then the last one I really want to highlight is that when you do engage with your Indigenous people or whatever country that you're in right now, make it meaningful. It's so easy to make these things tick box, say, yes, I've spoken to XYZ as part of that tribe, but then not form a relationship that's actually going to have an impact. So my last piece of advice is form the relationships that span more than just one single project or a single transaction. How can you help engagement that builds the local Indigenous economy rather than looking just to provide financial returns back to yourself? So look at that bigger, wider picture. And there you go. Thanks, Angie.
Thank you, May. Maxine, I know you mentioned some resources and you gave some tips like during your talk, your piece. Is there anything else in addition that you'd like to mention?
Yeah, I guess just just a couple of comments. It's okay not to know stuff. I think a worry that a lot of people have is that they know that they don't know, but and there's no excuse. Obviously, people need to take personal responsibility for informing themselves if they don't know things. But it's actually okay not to know stuff. We're all still learning. None of us know everything about all aspects of ED&I. So I think that's really important, that people don't feel that they're going to be stupid if they ask a question. I think the other thing that I sort of particularly try and focus on is about creating safe spaces for people to have those kinds of conversations, and that can be done in in a high profile way or a low key way, but just enabling people to understand that they can ask what they think might be a daft question and no one's going to judge them for that. I think that's really important. And I think the other thing is just about, it's thinking about how you make it kind of clear and obvious that you are an ally and that you want to be an ally. And it's a very English trait to be a bit, a bit low key about things, and to not kind of put yourself out there, and to not, especially if you're a woman as well, and to not shout about anything, but actually it needs to be visible. And I kind of talked about that in my piece as well, which is about, it's fantastic if you're doing things behind the scenes, but actually the power is in kind of being is articulating what you're doing as well. So yeah, those are just the other couple of things that I jotted down.
Thanks, Maxine. It's a really hard act to follow, all of you, after you've given your action tips. But the thing is, as I mentioned, representation matters, and it is. I think one thing that I'd like to stress: representation doesn't mean tokenism. It doesn't mean just having, just for image sake, that one person, that person of color, or that person with whatever physical challenge just there, and you're to really say I'm addressing ED&I. It's not a tick box exercise. And I think if I were to give some action points, I think it would be to have open conversations. The safe spaces that were mentioned is really important, because no one is going to speak up if they feel there are going to be repercussions. It's not about really saying who's right and wrong. It's really where if you are going to address these issues, there has to be open dialogue, open conversation, understanding what's happening. You know, I recently just mentioned, and I won't even go into too much details, but the thing is, I was really quite astounded. It's less than a month ago, I had a conversation, and it really was, I questioned some actions that were taking place that were quite public, but were quite exclusive. They were not inclusive. And I questioned, how can that be? And don't you realize this action? I think sometimes when you're challenged in that respect, I think I'd give the advice to others to think about what you say in response, because the thing is, it can be worse than the act itself. The response that I got, the language that was used was not appropriate. It was very much them and us. And it was basically, it was reflecting and saying there is a bias and people prefer that. And it was really where I couldn't believe what I was hearing. But it's really where I would say, really echoing some of the action tips that were given before. It's really think about what you're saying, educate yourself, and look from the other perspective. Try to put yourself in someone else's position so you understand what you are saying and what you are doing. Because the thing is, it's really where, after all the talk about equality, diversity, and inclusion, and anyone who's connected with me know that every day it's relentless. It's a conversation that happens all the time. Because for me, it's really where it's there every day. Every day. It's really where I have to deal with it every day. And this is the same with anyone else. But you know, when you have open dialogue and then you see something so obvious, so obviously incorrect, and you flag it and you get a response like that, you are astounded. You know, I talk about equality, diversity, and inclusion all the time, but the thing is, nothing prepares you for when you get a response that someone does not believe it's wrong, and they respond in that way. But hopefully this will be helpful. And what we're going to do now is we're going to move on to questions. I can see that some are coming through. Anwar? Does any of our panelists want to address this question first?
So Anji, I'll take a stab at this. I had a conversation with one of my bosses, and he was white, he was male, he was heterosexual, he was cis, and he said, I want to be an ally, I want to support you, but I don't feel like I can because I don't have that consideration. I don't understand the perspective that you're coming from. And I said, well, why don't you tell me what perspective you're coming from? And he said, well, you know, I grew up in a loving family. We were poor. We didn't have a lot of money. But once I got into college, then everything just kind of smoothed out and became easier for me. And so I said, well, let's go back then to when you were trying to get into college and when your family didn't have a lot of money. How did that feel? And by having that conversation, by giving him a point of reference that he could feel othered, it helped him to then translate that lived experience into some of the other ones. And so I think Tom's question is an excellent point. And really it is that in one way or another, we have all had a point in our life where we felt uncomfortable, or we felt like we didn't belong, or we felt like we weren't able to speak up. And taking that moment, taking that feeling, and then realizing that when you're speaking with someone else, they might be feeling it in that moment. And bringing that thought perspective to encouraging others to being a part of the answer and a support, even if for you it's not personal, That's the important key, is it doesn't have to be you personally affected for you to personally provide a solution.
Anji, I was just gonna add something to that, if I may.
Yes, please.
And I really like Tom's question as well. And I think, so my own partner, you know, white middle-aged male who works in a large corporate, and you know, their EDI systems are fantastic, and you know, he wants to be an ally, but I think sometimes it's hard for some men in his position and in other types of organizations to know what to do still. You know, I mean, I think they start to worry then too much about what they can and can't say. And so it's like, how do you even in the context that my partner's in, where, you know, there's all sorts of support, I think, you know, increasingly, you know, it's easy to feel a bit almost sort of marginalized yourself, because but not because that's where that anyone is actually coming from, but it's just like not knowing what to do about it and what language to use, and I think, you know, it comes down to role models again, doesn't it? You know, you want then that people, it's the underrepresented representing. You need people who are not necessarily directly affected by any of the issues, as you were just saying, to be the ones who are the advocates. And so maybe, you know, maybe we need to, I think, and the other thing I wanted to say here as well is that you don't, in providing, in my, you know, obviously from my perspective, in being able to provide platforms, you don't necessarily want the underrepresented individual on the platform representing the you know, that group, or it's so hard to get that balance right sometimes. So I think all of us still struggle, but it's always so helpful to be able to look and see what other organisations are doing. I'd be interested to see what Tom thinks we could be done here. You know, how can we make a difference? You know, what other sort of things has he seen? I mean, he's doing a great job of kind of standing up and advocating. But yeah, I don't know if anyone else has got anything else to add on that one. Yeah,
I agree with you, Maxine, because the thing is, often it's very easy for example, with regards to race, to look to those underrepresented populations to fix the problem. It's all of our problem. It's something for all of us to address, whether it's race, whether it's ableism, whether it's representation, culture, you know, from every aspect. But the thing is, it's sometimes I think it's the go-to and it's the easy thing to do, to try and almost, without realizing whatever setup you have, it's almost as though posing it to those individuals who are affected to try and come with the solutions, and it's not on. And you want representation across business as usual, don't you? So, you know, it's not that's what we're aiming for. So that but it's obviously a way off yet until we get to that point. But you don't even have to think about it. But we've got a long way to go. And we'll have a look at the next question. Would any of the panel like to address this question?
It's a difficult question. It's a good question. Well, maybe I can add something to it, especially from a personal perspective. I do think it's useful for allies to speak up, even if it's not their experience. And I say this with regards to, in some cultures, in some regions, I've seen that sometimes it's better to hear from, let's say, a male colleague versus, you know, someone who is affected. And in that sense, if you think about the goal is to get people to raise awareness and to get people to listen, it may not be a bad thing. It depends on the context, it depends on the culture. Sometimes that needs to happen, that even if the ally it may not be the experience, but they have enough evidence or to actually speak to it and to actually acknowledge, right? I don't know everything, but here's what I know. I mean, that's enough to start a discussion.
Yeah, I agree. In answer to this, I had to hold back, but the thing is, in answer to this, I think we should encourage. And the thing is, you're human. You can see when someone is not being treated right. It doesn't mean, if you see someone doing something wrong, you're not necessarily the victim, but you can see that this is happening. It's the same situation. So absolutely. I mean, the thing is, if Tom, for example, it's really where he sees this. Yes, someone may say, why do you care? You're not affected. But the thing is, like, why shouldn't he be an ally? Why shouldn't he speak up? Why shouldn't he do something about it? It's really where I think it goes back again. It's not the problem of just the affected. It's everyone's issue. It's everyone's problem. It's something for everyone to contribute to. And everyone should be taken account of equality, diversity, and inclusion, and ensuring that, not only the individuals, the practitioners within the sector, but also the activities reflect and address this issue.
And if I may add, Angie, it's also a question of why are you forcing the person or the group of people who it's being affected to? They're already being affected and you're asking them, please step up, right? that may be an additional responsibility when they might say, I don't have the capacity at the moment. So this is where you need allies to come in and to continue to advocate.
Yeah.
Right.
And if I can also just add to that, and I think as an ally, though, you don't necessarily in every situation need to be the one advocating, but you can be, you can be listening and you can be directing that person to somebody who may be able to help, who is more experienced than you in a particular area or understanding a particular perspective. So ally doesn't just mean being an advocate. I mean, I agree that speaking up is important and calling stuff out. Yes. But if you yourself don't feel confident in a particular area about how to represent that area, then you can still provide support by directing that individual to somebody who can help.
Yeah.
And I also want to say, being an ally sometimes just means listening. So as you've heard all of us say on this call, it's hard. And it doesn't go away just because it's the end of the day. It doesn't go away just because you're tired or you're busy. You're still dealing with the prejudice and the bias. And having an ally can just be a safe place, as we said, for you to go to someone and say, I just can't right now. And they say, I understand, I've got you. And oftentimes that's what I do with my allies, is if I go to a meeting, or if I'm in a coffee shop, or if I'm in a situation where I don't feel comfortable, I don't feel welcome, and I don't have the energy or the bandwidth to handle it anymore, I just turn to my ally and I say, I need your help. I need you to come and support me and give me your energy.
Thanks, Megan. I can see some great points that I mentioned also in the chat. Carol Barron mentioned the role models, the importance of role models across the broad range of backgrounds, the importance of this. And then also I can see Ines mentioned, you can see it posted here. Does anyone want to address this? Because the thing is, we deliberately designed this panel where it is all female. So I think it's important talking to Ines's point with regards to males disconnecting. Megan, do you want to address this?
I agree that is something that tends to be a question, and I tend to use Tom as my standard go-to right now. So Tom is here, he's listening, he's engaging, he's asking questions. And I think that's the point. It's one at a time. It's not that we're expecting everybody to respond right away, but it's one-on-one conversations that can make a difference too. It's bringing the resources and bringing the opportunities. So when we talk about engaging people, we do events like this, but we also provide resources to have those continued conversations. And that's what we ask of everyone, is that you have that conversation. You find that one point, that one opening that allows you to encourage someone to adapt a new mindset and to broaden out. It doesn't have to be in every aspect. It doesn't have to be in every way. But if you can start that conversation and start that journey, it makes a difference.
Thanks, Megan. Anwar, do we have any more questions? Please do post your questions in the question and answer box if you want them to be addressed.
Anji, if I may add to this point, it's that as we're talking to people, we're talking to researchers, we're talking to companies, there is a sea of change. So even if you think that people are not listening, they are listening. In the sense of, how is it affecting my business? This is one of the main questions that we see. Companies are starting to look at diversity issues. You know, Dr. Lisa Cook, who studied the issue of diversity and gender in the U.S., talks about, listen, if the fact that we're missing out on these amazing inventions that are coming from the underrepresented group is about 4% of the GDP per capita, right? It sounds small, but it's not. It's huge. And companies are thinking about this, and they are starting to implement policies. Maybe it works, maybe it doesn't work, but they are trying. They are aware, because they do realize it is affecting their profits. And even if we're thinking, they're not engaging, it's happening. It's happening. It may be slow and frustrating, but it is slowly changing.
And if I could add to that, thanks, Intan, is around really making everyone feel that they are of value, because I can see why certain stereotypes can feel disincentivized because we're always pointing them out. But how we've kind of taken that conversation, especially where I work at KiwiNet, is around finding the value that everyone brings in that diversity of thought in the thinking process and the decision-making process on how you come and look at decisions, what it is that we do in our processes and our strategic thinking, and making sure that when we do consider who is involved in that decision-making process, that there is true diversity of thought within that. And it might mean that I myself might think exactly the same way as a cis male Caucasian person, that is just what it is, but including someone else of a different background or race or whatever it is brings a different level of thinking to that decision-making process.
Thanks, May. The next question. I think we touched on this during some of the actual talk pieces, but who would like to address this question?
I'm happy to say a few words, Anji.
Thanks, Maxine.
Yeah, I mean, I kind of alluded in my presentation to the fact that, we've been really slow at documenting and making visible some of the things that we're doing in my organisation. But to my mind, that's because the measure of how successful or how committed we are is not because we have done the documentation. I mean, it's important, but it's, we're starting. So, having the statement up on your website does not mean that you are all committed to. And so that kind of tick box kind of effect is counterproductive. So whilst, I do want us to kind of get to where a lot of other organisations are and having things clearly articulated. And in fact, our new strat plan, it's kind of headline in there. So it's, it's not far away. I've been saying that for a while, but to me, it's more important to get it right than to rush and to just put something up there that doesn't mean anything because people are not committed to it. So yeah, just to reiterate that point, I guess.
You'll be called out anyway if you put something there and it's you're not practicing what you preach. It's really where the ED&I movement it's big and brave enough to actually call those who are just coming with token statements out. I can see there's another question. Nolene, if you have a look there, this is regarding ED&I data, because the thing is, one thing I wanted to touch on, as well as ED&I being addressed by every sector and some sectors being well ahead, particularly the commercial sector because of deep pockets, it really is where the only way that you can measure is by accounting for where you are and what your targets are, and then moving towards that. It is uncomfortable a lot of the time, but the thing is, this does mean collecting data. And this is a touchy point because obviously people are sensitive about data in general and how it's being used. And Nolene's question touches on that. Does anyone want to address this question?
Yeah, Andy, I think you're right. Data is important, and I think it's how it asks can make such a difference. So if the way that you ask for your data doesn't include what will happen to it, and to Nolene's first part, is it acceptable to ask how it is going to be used? Absolutely. If someone is saying, I need your gender, I need your race, I need your ability status, and they don't tell you why, then yeah, you should push back on that. What are they going to use it for? Is it a discriminatory purpose? Because that's definitely what comes to my mind first. So I think it's important to ask. And it's also equally important not to feel like you have to be identified a certain way. So if you don't feel comfortable using your pronouns, or you don't feel comfortable sharing your ability status, you should not feel forced into that situation. But in order for us to have change, we have to account. And I turn this to Intan a bit as the economist who publishes every other month, it seems, on this data. Intan, what is the value of having that data in making change?
Oh, I would love to have the data. I speak on all behalf of researchers. Having that data is amazing because it shines light, and it actually, some of the problems with identifying gender through names is that a name can, it's so fluid. For example, Ryan, which used to be male-dominated name, is now can also apply to women, right? So it's very, very difficult, and we're completely aware of it. But what we do know is that, when we talked about, what is the possibility of including, gender, asking applicants to reveal their gender, then the next question is, how is that going to be used, right? Exactly speaks to the issue of how you're going to use the data. And part of the reason is because some inventors are afraid that, what if the gender weighs into the decision of whether or not a patent is granted. Specifically, it shouldn't. But yeah, these kind of conversations is actually quite important. And I think there have been discussions of what if we collect the data, but we separate that data completely from when people are looking at the patent application itself. But then you get into discussions of, okay, but what happens if the patent examiner needs to talk to the inventor? Then they're going to see who it is, right? So it's discussion is not easy. I mean, it would solve so much if we have, the box that says, how do you identify yourself? That'd be great. But I mean, even at the global level, one of the things that's difficult is to go beyond the binary gender assignment. Because in some places it may not be safe for you to disclose your gender, how you identify. And so if you say a country X has only noted two genders, but the binary gender, the common female male, does it mean that there's none who are non-binary? No, it just means that maybe they don't feel safe, or maybe they do not want to disclose. So those are the things that when you start looking at it at a global level, you need to take that into consideration, because it is a huge discussion. But, having that box that says, how do you identify yourself? Oh, it'll make our lives so much easier. But we understand. And so therefore we go to the second best solution, which is, all right, we know the names that are out there. We've looked at the, dictionaries of name. And this is how we identify the probability, with a certain probability that this is a woman or this is a man. And that's all we can do.
Thanks, Intan. I can see in the discussion box, like Carol Barron has just mentioned that her practice is just moving slightly, that her practice is to have ED&I in job descriptions and commitment to deliver and promote equality, diversity, and inclusion in day-to-day work activities, and then ask for examples of what's been done. I think this is amazing. I think it's a great thing to do, and I think it really does get people thinking. Any opinions anyone wants to speak to, you know, that move, that novel move, which I think it's great, but hey.
I hope it becomes not so novel, because it's something that we incorporate into all of our job descriptions and adverts that go out as well. Is how have you engaged with local Maori iwi here, and what impact have you created from that? How do you support equity, inclusion, and diversity initiatives, and give us an example of that? It's a fantastic move, and hope it's 45 people in the session. I hope it's something that they can all take up.
Absolutely, because the thing is, in the UK, this is something that's quite new. It's great, you know, that it's being done elsewhere. I think it will get people thinking. It's really, hopefully you won't get those who just make something up. But it is where, you know, it does get the right, I think it is where the mindset, because it is a paradigm shift in the UK to actually incorporate equality, diversity, and inclusion, particularly in the technology transfer and knowledge exchange sector. But it will change things, definitely, by having this. And it'd be interesting to see, you know, how this pans out, how the individuals respond. But I think also it does mean that the right individuals will apply for these roles.
So what we've found with our respondees when they have answered these questions is actually it's okay to say, I don't know, but I'm keen to find out more, or I'm keen to learn more. And actually that is the biggest tick box, because you can say, yes, and this is how I'm going to support you on that journey as a new recruit into this company.
Yeah, no, that's fantastic.
It would be interesting to know, wouldn't it, how many interviews for leadership positions include that question, because that's where it's going to be really important.
Yes, because a lot of the time the movement, the discussion is at the grassroots level, at the coalface, and it really has to be really upwards as well, senior management, because the thing is, you're supposed to be leading and empowering, and if you are not practicing what you preach, it's really where you're going to have eventually a disenfranchised group that are just looking and thinking, I'm doing all this work, but yet still everything that's happening at the top doesn't reflect what we say is the ethos of, you know, or the culture of the institution or the community.
And I just want to emphasize
National Directors Forum. sorry, Megan.
Go ahead, Maxine.
No, it sounds like a topic for an international or a global directors forum, doesn't it?
Absolutely.
Yes, definitely. And I want to emphasize what May said here, because we're not saying that you have to have a fantastical answer, that you have to have a resume that lists all of the things that you have done in this space. But you have to have an awareness, and you have to be willing to learn, and you have to be willing to grow. So when confronted with that question, don't shy away from it. Instead, embrace it and take it as a call to action and an opportunity to expand who you are and how you present. And an example that I would think would be appropriate is I watched a webinar on this topic, right? So you don't have to go out and do something enormous. You just have to take the next step forward.
Yeah. And what do we have? We've still got some more time if we can take one or two more questions.
So Anji, I want to send out a challenge. So for anyone who is part of this webinar, or anyone who watches it later. I challenge you that within the next 24 hours, you do something different to support someone who is different from you. Whether that be asking a potential licensee what they're doing for EDI, whether that be putting part of your RFI or RPI or RFA or MDA or MTA or any other agreement that we work with in tech transfer, putting a line that says you expect them to increase opportunity and engagement, or whether that be turning on the captions in your next Zoom call, or whether that be checking the panel that you've got lined up, or whether that be adding on EDI to your next conference session. But I challenge everyone within the next 24 hours to make one change that creates a more welcoming environment.
I love that, Megan. Thank you so much. I saw one question, Anwar, that you had. Okay, let's take this last one before we come to a close. This talks to the fact that, you know, a lot of the time we've been talking about the team, the composition of the team and the individuals who are practitioners within the sector. But it's also, you know, as you know, technology transfer, knowledge exchange is about progressing innovation. And it's really where those third parties that we interact with, it's ensuring that those individuals, that sometimes they are representing us as well. Do they comply with our way of thinking, our way of proceeding? Is it acceptable to ask the question, where's your policy? Do you actually practice it? Anyone want to address this question?
I would say that it's absolutely acceptable to ask the question. I'm just seeing, as we see capital come into a lot of our startup companies here in New Zealand, that there is an ESG, environment, social and governance policy that's being pushed onto, like, for the receiving of any venture capital funds. There's actually a mandate that says within the terms and conditions of the receiving that funding that you have to have a policy in place about how many women do you employ? What is that, the differential between what your highest male would earn compared to your woman doing the exact same job. That has to be disclosed and has to be transparent and open to the investors who are actually tipping money into your company, and probably the same as if you were going to license out as well. So that's what this question is asking. But that transparency and that call to action is actually being pushed through downwards, and it's mandated. So in order to get that capital into your business, into your new startup, it's actually something that is actually being called out on. Having women on your governance board, for example, what's the proportion of male in your senior leadership team versus female? What does that look like in terms of your highest paid worker and your lowest paid worker and your highest paid leader? And what does that differential look like? And if it's too big, then actually your venture capitalist firm is not really happy to pour in that money to support it. So it's interesting times, and I think we'll see that grow and grow, and would be keen to hear what the situation is like over in the UK and the US and in Geneva, where you are, Intan.
I was just going to just reflecting on that, thinking, you know, obviously from my perspective, you know, when we have a limited number of suppliers because we, you know, mostly we're running events and things. So our suppliers are big venues and things like that. And when we're able to do that, but wouldn't it be interesting also, obviously, and in that situation, you have some power because you're the one with the money and you're buying a service. Wouldn't it be interesting to ask the question of your customers as well? You know, am I as an organization prepared to take money from an organization that is not committed to these principles? And if you think from the context of Praxis and a membership organization, you know, should it be something, you know, actually it would be useful in terms of information and gathering, wouldn't it, about the way that our sector operates. Can we, do you have this kind of policy in place, or and sharing examples. So we've got, each of us have the opportunity to raise that to raise that question, and to use it for in different ways, maybe to just to collect more data.
Yeah, I completely agree. I mean, the thing is, it's perfectly acceptable. A certain level of due diligence is done anyway when you're interacting with any third party, and it's in the past, and it still continues with regards to the tobacco industry, and certain activities with regards to animals. It's really where, so why not question and really choose who you engage with, and ensure that they are aligned with your practices. For sure, I think that's the way forward. I think that's the future. Thank you for the panel. We're going to come to a close now, and thank you for all those who have stayed with us to this point. May is going to just close this session.
Oh, thank you, Angie. So as I'm just going to reiterate, as a panel, we'd all like to thank you for attending, for listening and engaging with the questions. So today we've put in front of you a huge buffet of action steps that you can choose from to implement. But you've really almost done the hardest bit, which is walking through that restaurant door and taking a seat at that table. So please continue to engage, ask questions, have those discussions with your family, your friends, your work colleagues, your bosses, and bring them to the table too. And lastly, I'd like to finish off by just making a plug for a couple of conferences that are coming up, which include equity, diversity and inclusion sessions. The first is the ASP conference, which is in Lisbon on the 20th of May. And there will be a session there on, is our innovation ecosystem diverse enough? So a very thought-provoking question there. So if you're interested, please rock along to that. And secondly, the ParxisAuril conference, which is in Brighton on the 7th of June, which will have a session on global equality, diversity, and inclusion in the tech transfer. And the session is titled "Being Invited and Then Being Asked to Dance." There will also be a special interest group that will follow this conference, so keep an eye out for that. And the absolute final thing that I would just like to say before I send you all on your way is that this is the first session in a series of free webinars that focuses on different aspects of equity, diversity, and inclusion. And I encourage you all to attend the other two that are coming along and to look out for that in the next month or so. So ngā mihi, kia ora, and thank you.
Thank you.